Hi, good morning and welcome to the House Environment and Energy Committee. We are having an off-session special meeting today to receive and take some comment on the inventory report from Act 59 and Act relating to community resilience and biodiversity protection. And that process has been headed up by the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, and we welcome them. Trey Martin.
Good morning. For the record, I am Trey Martin from the Vermont Housing Conservation Board, where I am the Director of Conservation and Rural Community Development. And I have been the staff person at the ACB who's been most closely associated with this project. So it's a great pleasure to be here this morning and talk about almost 2 years worth of work to get to this point and to look ahead to the almost 2 years of work that is still ahead of us in this process. I'm going to say a few words this morning about just the process to date on behalf of Nature for Justice, our consultant, Soraya Hightower, who led the input process and the inventory process that we conducted is out of town and unavailable. So I'm going to speak on her behalf. I'm going to invite Secretary Moore up, who I don't see here yet, after that, and then she will hand it off to Gus Seelig, the Director of Vermont Housing Conservation Board. They both want to make some introductory remarks and talk about the work that is ahead of us and the enthusiasm of both of our at the agency and at the board for this work. And then what I'm going to do is take you through each of the questions that's in the inventory section of the law and give a quick summary of how we approach those. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion as we go along or when we get to the end of the presentation. So I'll start by just putting this slide up with this lovely picture of Westmore, Vermont, and a project that we conserved years ago after almost a generation of striving to bring it under conservation and a lot of effort. A great photo from actually the former TNC director. And you can see there what we've done is sort of summarize the vision set forth in Act 59 for this work, which is a really broad vision that looks at the goals of conserving 30 by 30 and 50 by 50 through that suite of values that Agency of Natural Resources and Conservation Board, Housing Conservation Board brings to this work. We have been really focused for the last year on this inventory, both at the ACB and at the agency. And we think that the inventory that we've prepared is still a draft. It's going to be finalized by the end of the summer. But it provides a great foundation of data. There are recommendations in that laid out for the next steps in the process going forward. And it also provides what we really wanted to give to you is a survey or an inventory of public perceptions, values, goals, hopes, ideas about conservation in Vermont. And there's hundreds of pages documenting those public inputs from the process. All of this underscores the important framing of the Act 59 vision, which, as I said, is summarized there, and helps us to call for what we hope will be increased public investments and increased private investments to bring forward the actions that this Act calls for. We're very much looking forward to the next phase, where we go from inventory and cataloging, describing what is, to planning for what we want to do over the next 25 years. And I am going to give you a few slides to document our process. And as I said, hand it off to Secretary Moore and then to Gus Seelig, who are going to talk about the ways that ANR looks forward to this work through the lens of Vermont Conservation Design, which is a really important framing tool. And it's the centerpiece of the Act in some ways. And it's also a focal point for the agency and how they approach their work. And then Director Seelig is going to talk to you about how we see the enthusiasm with which we create the opportunity to increase protections for biodiversity across the whole suite of programs, conservation programs that the HCB runs. But like I said, before I do that, just a couple of factual slides here. So the organizations who led this effort were principally Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. We produced the inventory report that was uploaded on our website as a draft final and sent to you as a draft final at the end of last month. We did this in consultation with the Agency of Natural Resources, who poured hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of staff hours into this effort. And like I said, Nature for Justice and Soraya Hightower led the inventory process with the public. The other organizations listed there are all organizations who also dedicated dozens or hundreds of staff hours to support the process. They're not the authors of the report, and nor does the fact that they're listed here mean that they agree with all of the conclusions or recommendations. But we want to specifically call out those 6 organizations and also note that dozens of other organizations participate through surveys, interviews, focus groups, hosting focus groups, and we could not have done this without the interest of the greater public. There are the numbers. I think I shared these with you at the end of the session. Pretty robust public process that saw inputs from hundreds of Vermonters as we went through. And there's the timeline, the statutory timeline that's laid out. So we are at the end of, or we're nearing the end of phase 1. Technically, calendar-wise, we're a little bit over time. There's a little bit more data crunching and analysis we're going to do this summer, as well as getting another round of public comments on what we put forward in this draft final inventory. We'll finish that up and resubmit it to the legislature at the end of August. Then we go into phase 2, which is the conservation planning phase. The report lays out, and I'll talk a little bit later about how we envision, at least now, going forward into that. And then from 2026 through 2050, we're in implementation, seeking to add hundreds of thousands of conserved acres to the conserved lands portfolio in Vermont. Last note that I'm going to make before I hand it off to Secretary Moore is about the annexes to the report. I just want to make sure that people understand that the report that VHCB developed comprises several sections at the beginning of the document. It's when you click on it on our website, it says Act 59 Inventory Report, but there's also a place to click through to see all of the working group reports that were prepared as part of this process, as well as to see the Nature for Justice annexes. And there's an annex for each of the various questions that were asked in the legislation. And that comprises the bulk of the report, which is a reflection of both public inputs and then Nature for Justice recommendations that they made to us on the basis of that, some of which you could see are very close to the recommendations VHCB landed on, and there are some places where we make recommendations in a different way.
We're having real trouble, some of us finding the report on your webpage. Where would we find it?
There's a webpage under our programs. It says Vermont Conservation Strategy Initiative. And if you scroll down that, you see a place that says click here to read the inventory report. And then right below that, it says click here for working group reports or annexes.
Is that under news or our program?
Under
Our programs.
Okay, okay,
It's over there.
okay. I was looking at news, okay.
Could you repeat that again so I can?
Yeah, on the VHCB homepage, on the left of the logo, you see something that says our programs. And then if you click through to Vermont Conservation Strategy Initiative.
You're way ahead of me.
Oh.
I think I'll just listen.
Very good for now. We'll get you to it.
I'm
I've
good.
been trying to do more of that myself, representing this one. But listen up. All right, so that's as much as I wanted to say sort of to tee this off. I do want to hand this off to Secretary Moore now. And Secretary, you can advance the buttons here with the arrows. And there's also slides here if you like.
Double screen it
Yeah,
here.
there you
All
go.
right. Good morning.
Morning.
All right. My apologies for being a few minutes late this morning. For the record, great, thank you. For the record, I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources, and thought I could offer a little bit of context about the important role that Vermont Conservation Design plays in this overall work. As I'm sure many of you are aware, Vermont Conservation Design is a science-based framework, and it's been designed to support and sustain an ecologically functional and connected landscape. So this includes thinking about natural areas, forests, waters, as well as the specific needs of wildlife and plants. So in essence, Vermont Conservation Design is a science-based framework for biodiversity. And we use Vermont Conservation Design because we know an ecologically functional landscape provides critical environmental services. Things like clean air and water, carbon sequestration, and flood protection. And it's really through this framework, we are thinking about biodiversity, not on a species by species approach, but at the broad landscape scale. And, to my mind, VCD really marked a significant shift away from our previous management and conservation work at the agency, away from this species by species approach and towards a landscape level view. VCD also supports numerous social and economic values, including outdoor recreation, the forest products economy, and the natural beauty that draws people to Vermont. Vermont Conservation Design, as I'm sure you're all aware, is led by the Fish and Wildlife Department within ANR, but it really reflects input and expertise from all three departments of the agency, as well as conservation professionals from partner organizations, including the Nature Conservancy, the Vermont Land Trust, UVM Extension, Northeast Wilderness Trust, and many others. And we know that land acquisition is an essential tool to achieve the vision of Vermont Conservation Design, but it is not a map of land that needs to be permanently protected through ownership or easement. Sustaining an ecologically functional landscape in Vermont will take the full range of conservation tools. So this includes thoughtful stewardship and management practiced by public agencies, but also private landowners. Two-screen thing is not my strength, apparently.
Did you play the piano?
No, that may be part of my challenge. So I see Vermont Conservation Design as cornerstone to achieving the goals of Act 59, and look at the next phase of the Act 59 work, the conservation planning, as to further help operationalize Vermont Conservation Design for use by partners throughout the state in designing local and regional initiatives. Specifically, Vermont Conservation Design can be used to take the analysis of existing conserved lands that's reflected in the draft inventory report you all have, to identify ecologically important areas that are not protected or may be a priority for enhancement. And this will help practitioners decide how to enhance and promote elements on already conserved lands and also where to focus our future protection efforts. It can help us think about decisions in terms of what tools to use and when, how to direct limited conservation funding. ANR is also already using Vermont Conservation Design in a manner I believe is consistent with the goals of Act 59. And the best example of that is in our management of state lands. And that includes state forests, state parks, and wildlife management areas. These lands are managed for a suite of values and provide myriad benefits to Vermonters. And we also know they are critical to meeting our shared conservation goals. We use Vermont Conservation Design to look across the more than 360,000 acres that the agency owns and stewards on behalf of Vermonters to balance the range of public uses and protect and promote a connected and functional landscape, in essence, to guide our management actions. VCD also ensures we're considering how ecological interests extend off state lands and how we can manage state lands accordingly to ensure that habitat connectivity is protected. I think it's important to also know, sorry, skipped ahead, that permanent conservation isn't our only tool. Nor can it be. Conservation is inextricably tied to the decisions of private landowners and how they manage their lands. So as a result, ANR also uses Vermont Conservation Design to direct not only our land conservation efforts, but also so much more of the agency's work that we do around landowner outreach and engagement. One of my favorite experiences while serving in this role was an opportunity I had to go into the field with Keith Thompson from the Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, who's our private lands forester. And while we were driving around, he told me he saw his job as helping each landowner believe they own the most unique and fantastic piece of Vermont there is, and to fall in love with their land. And that love of place is going to be essential to achieving our conservation goals. And we need to not lose sight of that important engagement and outreach work that's essential to a functional landscape level connectivity. Thinking a little bit beyond biodiversity, because BCD does so much more than that. It is looking at across the landscape, regardless of public or private ownership or town boundaries. This is something that's really important. We know that wildlife doesn't see property boundaries, even though we really like to. And also know that much of the lands that need to be protected for an ecologically functional landscape often also sustain other values, things like outdoor recreation, working farms and forests, clean water, scenic vistas, and climate resilience. And with thoughtful planning, these uses can be compatible with Vermont Conservation Design's goal to maintain that ecologically functional landscape, including helping us identify appropriate places for development and affordable housing. Vermont Conservation Design can also be combined with other plans and tools to help us achieve the goals of Act 59. A couple of recent examples, the Forest Futures Strategic Roadmap and Move Forward Together Vermont, which is our outdoor recreation plan. Both can be paired with Vermont Conservation Design. I probably should say can and will be paired with Vermont Conservation Design to get a more holistic understanding of community needs as well as ecological needs. And as always, we need to ensure that any applications of Vermont Conservation Design and all our actions are equitable and just, supported by broad and meaningful public engagement and hearing from the full range of Vermont voices. As you all know, Act 154 of 2022, which is Vermont's environmental justice law, works to ensure all Vermonters have equitable access to environmental benefits and protects communities from disproportionate environmental burdens, including things like limited access to green space. The EJ law places ANR in a leadership role in improving the way that state government engages Vermonters in decision-making processes. And both VHCB and ANR see EJ and equity as core to our respective missions, and both organizations are committed to an inclusive process for all stages of Act 59 implementation, including the development of the draft inventory as well as the planning document going forward. Happy to answer any questions you might have, but otherwise would turn it over to Gus for some opening remarks as well. And would only note that I need to duck out about 11 o'clock because there's quite a bit going on at the moment.
And thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Do members have questions? Not right now.
Okay.
Good morning. For the record, Gus Seelig, Director for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Let me start with a big thank you for asking us to take this on. It's exciting and timely work. And really important as we try to, as a board, balance our dual mission of housing and conservation. Voices for biodiversity are raised up. So really critical time for this conversation to happen across Vermont. I want to especially thank Trey for leading this effort on our staff, for Gannon Osborne on Julie's staff, and for Gus Goodwin and Jim Shallow at the Nature Conservancy, who all contributed greatly to this first phase of work, and lots of other people, as you saw from all the consulting we've done. Some people have asked me, why did you begin to engage the public in the inventory process? And I've said, maybe that wasn't the wisest decision, but I think it's always good to hear from the public and to hear the disparate voices that we've heard that go from the spectrum of the Vermont Traditions Coalition to Standing Trees. And I think all those voices do need to be heard. And I need your help at this point, which is to say, we need help to create unity in order for the plan that we end up coming up with to be accepted by Vermonters. And how we do that is a challenge, given all of the viewpoints that we have heard from. We have a broad statutory mission, and it's up here. And we didn't use words like biodiversity when the board was formed. We didn't even use climate change. We hadn't even come to global warming or smart growth as terms. But when you look at our statute, it does tell us to protect important natural areas. It talks about protecting lands that have rare and endangered species. And so the seeds were there, many, many years ago, back in the mid-80s. And I can tell you that one of our founding board members understood at that time and began to give me an education that we had a biodiversity crisis. I think sometimes it's hard for people to relate to what that crisis means for humans, but if the health of lots and lots of species is in bad health, we have to begin to think about what does that mean for human health. And I think we just need to help Vermonters tie that together, that when species are dying at such an alarming rate, that maybe the environment's going to not be too friendly to us either if we don't take good care of it. So I don't see this as just about biodiversity by itself, but also fundamental to human health and human well-being, and I see our mission that way. The picture here of the Walcott Community Forest, obviously wonderful kids having a great time on what is 705 acres of land, but it speaks to a landscape that is connected to Green River Reservoir State Park, Elmore State Park, the Eastville Wildlife Management Area, the Memorial Rail Trail. You can walk there from the village of Walcott. There's 4.7 miles of headwater streams. Clearly, critically important piece of land. We are at a place in our conservation work with more than 400,000 acres that we've invested in, most of that forested, where the Vermont Conservation Design and doing this work is absolutely essential to taking the next steps forward. And how we do it and how we increase the rate and support of the work we need to do to conserve another 180, 200,000 acres of land just to get to the 30% goal is an enormous undertaking, because there's not another Champion Lands project out there. There's not even a parcel like the one Trey opened the slideshow. Maybe there's one or two that are in the several thousand acre parcel. But we're going to be doing this, I think, primarily hundreds of acres at a time and sometimes smaller acreages. So that's going to take more capacity. It's going to take more stewardship. It has been an enormous lift for the partners just to give time to this planning effort, much less the effort of actually negotiating with landowners. I want to say at the outset that there is room for growth in public ownership, but I think, as has been our history, we're going to need private owners to be significant participants or we can't achieve these goals. And most landowners do, as Julie said, love the land that they own. How they can afford it and make it work for all the purposes that we have in mind is always an essential question. A piece of our work is equity and inclusion. It's written into this parcel, into the law. And I think emblematic by this parcel that we recently conserved, Vermont Land Trust played a leadership role in helping Camp, this parcel move from being Camp Sunrise to Camp Outright, which is a wonderful outcome from a public recreation and education point of view. But there's also 115 acres of forest here, some of which is considered to be highest priority interior block forest under Vermont Conservation Design, and 21 acres of wetland. So our landscape is always integrated with lots of values, and we're not going to be able to just focus on tiny little pieces to achieve our goal. We need to have a broad vision with lots and lots of uses to it. This week reminds us of the importance of floodplain restoration, and just again to say thank you for charging us with focusing on biodiversity. About a decade ago, now retired Chair Dean called me into his committee room, and we had a private conversation. He said, how about if I add protecting the surface waters of the state to your statute? And I said, David, I always thought that was part of our statutory charge. He said, well, I just want to make it explicit. This is floodplain restoration in Brattleboro at the Whetstone. This picture doesn't do the size of the parcel justice, but the Vermont Rivers Conservancy is doing a great job. It was Sossamo's Sosassamo lumber site, and they have taken lots of material out to lower the floodplain. David described the Whetstone after Irene as a dinky little brook that did a huge amount of damage, took out lots of homes. We've showed you pictures of that. Last summer's flooding has undermined a bridge to the state's largest mobile home cooperative with more than 300 homes. We have a plan to move some of those homes out of the wettest areas, but until the bridge is rebuilt, we can't bring new homes in. So doing this kind of restoration work is essential to a piece of the charge that I think that you've given us. This is another story of community resilience in Northfield. There were 7 homes here when Irene hit. It's now the Dog River Park. It was featured on Marketplace last year because it flooded again, but the park was out of commission for just 3 days. So examples of what we're going to need to do all over the state. Wanted to just speak briefly to agriculture, and I know that's one of the touch points that you've heard a lot about, that we've heard a lot about. On the right is a farm retirement project where we're taking land out of production on the Maidstone. On the left is really a conversion up in Highgate, Vermont, of a farm, and you see what it looked like in 1999 when it was a conventional dairy farm. The son took over because of the sale of development rights. And he last year won the Aldous Leopold Award. And there are all kinds of conservation benefits that have come from that, but also come from our daily work with the Vermont Land Trust and with landowners on farms, where we are adding additional protections on a regular basis. Every time we do something called a retroactive OPAV, we upgrade the easements and add protections when they are appropriate. And VLT can talk with you more about the kind of work they do. They work regularly with DEC as well in terms of overlay easements that add the kinds of restoration protections that I think Act 59 has in mind. And that last week's events call for us to think about. This is the Huntington Town Forest, and I guess I just want to conclude my piece of this by saying to you that it will take an enormous amount of money to do the work that you've asked us to undertake, to do another 200,000 acres of land. We will leverage it as much as we can, but the faster we need to go, the less leverage there'll be. So whether we set a goal to do this over the next 5 years or we take a longer time, it's going to take resources, but it's not just a matter of acquisition. The organizations that we have relied upon over the last 35 or 40 years have capacity challenges themselves. We've always invested some in capacity, but an increase in our goals from an annual rate of conservation of 12,000 acres a year to a much higher goal means we need additional capacity at our partner organizations, including at the state of Vermont. Okay, and then I'm sure, underestimated 35 years ago what stewardship would mean and what stewardship obligations would mean. And how we fund and support stewardship will also be an important question as we develop an implementation plan that we'll be talking with you more about. So I think with that, and knowing that you have other witnesses and that Trey's going to run through the questions, I'm going to stop here.
There are 10 questions. Again, Trey Martin for the record from VHCD. There are 10 questions in section 2803 of the law that was passed as Act 59. The inventory report, the part that VHCD's analysis provides both an executive summary, which is in these slides I'm going to go through, and then a longer analysis of each question before we go into the annexes.
Do we have your access to your presentation?
I will send you a presentation. I haven't sent it yet, but I'm happy to send it.
Yeah. Hard to see the slides even with 2 screens with small font.
As soon as I'm done talking, I will send it to you. Actually, Secretary Moore is going to forward it to you.
Great,
Can
thanks.
you send it to me? I'll post it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was working on this morning, so I apologize for that. So the first question it was focused on the categories that were defined in Act 59. The ecological reserve area, the biodiversity management area, and the natural resource management area. And the first question asks us to look at whether those definitions should be expanded, modified, or changed within the scope of the bill. I think largely because they're very good definitions, and also because we wanted to keep this as simple as possible for this first inventory. I say first because the act charges us with updating this every 2 years. We took the approach of not recommending any changes to those three definitions, but working to identify how conserved lands fit into them right now. This question also asks us to identify the types of agricultural lands that support and restore biodiversity. And our recommendation for this first inventory is that conserved lands do that. We included those in the inventory for this initial report to you. And we can explain more of that later if you wish. We also, in doing that, what we tried to do is lay out the types of land that fit into those so that if you look at that natural resource management area in particular, you can see how it divides between land that's in forest or natural cover and land that's in agricultural production or open space. So for all intents and purposes, the data about what's different between natural resource management in a forested area versus on an agricultural parcel is already sort of laid out for you there. We also identified about 42,000 acres that we weren't able to categorize for this initial report, which we described as uncategorized lands for now. And as both through the rest of the summer and between now and the next inventory cycle, we're going to be working to identify whether those fit into the first three categories and or whether we should have a fourth category for lands that don't fit anywhere else. The second question was focused on the amount of conserved land that fits into the three categories. And so this slide lays that out. Again, sorry, it's so small, but I can read it to you. There are roughly almost 500,000 acres in the ecological reserve area category and biodiversity conservation area together. So about 236, 239,000 acres respectively, or each of those roughly 4% of the Vermont landscape, excluding surface waters. In the natural resource management area, there are roughly 1.1 million acres. That's roughly 19% of Vermont's land area. And that includes 16% of the land area in forest land or natural cover and roughly 3% in agriculture or open land. A total of 1.5 million, almost 1.6 million acres, or a little bit less than 27% of Vermont's landscape. And then again, there are about close to 50,000 acres that we'd like to continue to analyze. Many of those are held by the state in some form. Some of them are will likely fit into those three categories, and some of them could be described as a category 4 in the future. Two of the questions in the inventory focused on policies, programs, practices, and how to best use those to achieve the goals. So what we've done in the response to those two questions is first combine the two questions. There's an annex that combines for those as well. And the annexes in the document describe just a great deal. There's a huge number of programs, practices, policies that we use in the state of Vermont to protect land. We did not go through the exercise of saying yet which of those are the most important for the implementation phase of this, but we are proposing in the inventory response to dedicate a whole work group in our second phase of this to focus on what are the best strategies through those programs, policies, and practices that we should use going forward. So we'll be dedicating a lot of time to sort of, prioritizing those as we go forward. We also will obviously have to identify which of those go with the best funding opportunities, either state level funding, federal funding, or private funding. Question 4 in section 2803 asked how state lands could be used to increase conserved ecological reserve areas. And we worked very closely with the Department of FPR and other A&R folks, as well as a number of stakeholders, to describe the kinds of practices within A&R's current processes, or not the kind of practices, but the kind of the updates to A&R's processes that could be made in order to really enhance the designation of ecological reserve areas on state lands, from developing guidelines and a statutory designation for ecological reserve within the A&R, guidelines and policies, creating new management subclasses, and then, really focusing the conservation design on designating those areas. Another key aspect going forward that neither the Secretary nor Gus mentioned yet is looking for ways to streamline the way that we do business. We do need a large increase in capacity funding as well as acquisition funding to do this. we also need to look at what we do and say, can we do this more efficiently and faster? And one of the ways is to think about how, when we designate lands for public ownership, those are eased or protected through easements. And do we need multiple easement holders when we've asked the agency to hold a parcel of land? And it may be that we can do that in a much more simple way going forward. We may be able to do that with municipal lands or lands held in fee by land trusts. So if we can find those ways to do that, that will help us to bend the cost curve, which is going to be significant.
The slides are up for members and the public who want to look at them up on our webpage.
The next section, thank you, Madam Chair. The next question was focused on implementing Vermont conservation design. I'm not going to read this to you. I think the Secretary did a great job of describing their approach to conservation design. I think I'll just underscore one thing that she said, which is that conservation design provides an incredibly valuable way to overlay this tool on the landscape and help us and communities to identify the values of lands that might be protected. But to underscore her comment, conservation design is also agnostic about how you protect those lands. And so it is not focused on this kind of conservation or that kind of conservation. It is focused on the lands of highest connectivity and natural resource value. And we think that that's going to be a great opportunity in the next phase to go to communities and show them how it works and show that how it applies to their land so that we can get communities to help us to identify what lands that are highest priority to protect that are also consistent with this really important tool. Question 6 is, I mentioned earlier that we were talking about the percentage of the landscape that doesn't include surface waters. The bill didn't include lands and waters in the definition in the 30 by 30 or 50 by 50 goals, but it included this really critical question about how we can use conservation to support and to enhance the work that our regulatory systems do. And that's kind of the approach that the working group and that VHCB recommends here, is to not to try and duplicate or to do through conservation what we can do through regulation, but look to see how can we enhance and support regulatory outcomes with really strategic conservation. If the river corridor law that passed this year is going to protect certain areas or if critical resource areas under the new Act 250 framework are more highly protected than they have in the past, there are still going to be places that we think are important to conserve. For those river corridors, it might be the headwater forests that are further away from and maybe not included in that mapping, but they're obviously critical to that downstream health. Likewise, with the critical resource areas, there might be places that are supportive of those areas from an ecological standpoint that become more important to protect than areas that are otherwise already protected through these regulatory tools. So another way that we might be able to bend the cost curve and to focus our work on the places that are most needful for conservation. Obviously, always being mindful that conservation is the action of a willing landowner working with a willing conservation organization. Skipping question 7 because it was done with question 3. Question 8 asked about financing and funding. Again, there's a work group report that goes into great detail about our current rate of conservation. That's in the annex. And this question provides some further analysis of this. But we do find at the end that we need to double or triple the acquisition funding as well as capacity and stewardship funding in order to go forward. We think that the amount of money that we spend each year probably doesn't need to double or triple if we can use some of those cost cutting or innovative streamlining approaches. But we're going to have to really think carefully about what the state who provides the most flexible and foundational dollars for our work. What enhancements could we see in funding through ANR or through VHCB or directly to partners? What can we do to draw down more federal funding, which is largely a question of capacity at ANR, at VHCB, and other organizations that manage those grants? And then how do we map that in conjunction with what private actors are going to do? With or without public funding, there are numerous organizations that work largely or wholly with philanthropic dollars. And it's our intention in the next phase in the work group that we designate for financing and funding to really think about where do those two worlds mesh and meet, and can we be strategic about the roles of private partners and private funding to complement and to support public partners and public funding. we provide an assessment, an initial assessment, although there's a lot more work to do in this, and I'd be remiss in not saying that this is probably the area that we, although we consulted with so many people during this process, where we have the longest to go to meet stakeholders where they are in terms of building both a process and a set of outcomes that's supportive of the really wide ranging set, the goals and hopes and wishes and dreams that people have. And there are ways that we'll be approaching that in the next phase of this work. And we will certainly be working through the Environmental Justice Program and A&R, through the Land Access Opportunity Board that's attached for administrative purposes to VHCB, and through other, currently formed public bodies that are working on equity and inclusion, as well as thinking about how to pull stakeholders towards us. And then finally, you asked us about intergenerational land transfers. This question was something we didn't spend a lot of public process on. It wasn't something that the public commented on greatly, but with really great support from Department of FPR and from a group of stakeholders who have been working on this issue for years, including VHCB's Farm and Forest Viability Program. We provide a set of recommendations in the report for next steps and actions to support either conservation or conservation planning for the moments where land transitions between generations and families. And Gus mentioned and Julie mentioned the amount of land that's privately held in Vermont still. And so this is, I don't know if this is still true, but when I was at A&R, we were saying that, roughly 7% of the land is forested, 80% of that is owned privately, and 80% of that is owned by people who are nearing or in retirement. And so there's a lot of pressure coming on those transfers. And there are a lot of concrete actions kind of laid out in the report for what to do there. Two more quick slides. I don't know why that one's cut off like that. But this is the next steps. So there's an immediate next step, which is later this week. We will be closing the portal, but stakeholders have until the end of the day on July 19th. That's this Thursday, to provide written comments. We put a Google form on our webpage to facilitate our review of those and to give people an easy framework to provide those comments to us. By August 30th, we will both provide a response to those as well as a finalized inventory. There may be changes based on the comments. There are certainly some data updates that we're continuing. And then we will submit that again to this body, to the Committee on Agriculture and to the Senate Committee on Natural Resources. Through the rest of the summer and into the fall, we'll be working to hire a project manager for the next phase, to form a steering committee or technical advisory committee, to form those two work groups I mentioned, and to set a foundation for the regional listening sessions that we would like to be able to do. In the spring, we'll be doing that work, including, hopefully regional listening sessions, playing forward those work groups and the work they're going to do on programs, policies, practices, financing, and funding. And then next summer, trying to integrate that into a plan that we can share with you all in the public by the end of the summer. That's based on the current timeline. We would like to end with this, which is these are ways that this committee and your body could support us. One is that we are going to ask you for additional funding to conduct the next step of the process. That regional listening session process is going to require leadership from local bodies, and having the ability to help them host us by giving them capacity and funding to do that is a critical need. We also have a need for support for the ongoing data analysis and governance and design of data that this report calls for. That was something that we really had to pull from lots of different directions, including NGO partners, to do this initial analysis. And so more capacity is certainly needed there at the agency. A&R received some initial funding from this body for the planning phase, but that is used in order to continue to have them in the consultation role. Sure that Secretary Moore would like to talk to you about support for that. And then the last thing here is something that I'd like to ask for your consideration, which is, could we would like an extra 6 months to complete the planning phase, so that we could spread that timeline out that I showed you just a second ago, which is very compressed, to do all of the regional work and to do the 12 public meetings and 3 public, open public meetings, as well as those work group processes. So something to consider as we go forward. over the longer term, as Gus and Julie both noted, we really also need to sit down and plan out what is this body's capacity to support this at the state level, knowing that those state level investments through VHCD, through ANR, and through other sources are the most important, the most flexible ways to build capacity to draw down federal grants, to match those grants, to pass through the partners, and obviously for the projects that we do at the state level. I'm going to ask Secretary Moore and Gus to join me maybe, or to just be available for questions for the remainder of our time.
I have a question for you, just sort of a nuts and bolts question. Strikes me that there's no map included with this, nor a list of inventory lands, nor information on the criteria used to inventory the lands and put them in categories. Or if there is, I haven't seen it.
That's one of the things that will be updated before the end of the summer. We are working on a map as well as a sort of a spatially explicit format to show you. But it has been far more challenging than we anticipated to be able to go through all of the data sets, which didn't match the few categories, to transfer them. And so we've gotten through the crunching of that at a pretty rough level. We want to continue to refine that and to produce that into a map. But we didn't feel confident enough in the analysis that we've done by June 30th to include a map yet in the initial document.
Thank you. I want to thank you for this work and for the enthusiasm with which you have taken it on and the heavy lift that it is. So, and recognizing the resources that many organizations in the state, but in particular your two, that have gone into making this happen. So thank you very much for that. I do think it's important for you to comment on the inclusion of all agricultural lands in the inventory. In particular, I feel like it was clear in the statute that we were not anticipating all agricultural lands would be included. Not that they're not very important to our food resilience and agricultural economies, but that they don't necessarily support biodiversity. And I also like the way that we ended up crafting the statute with the sort of focus on permanent conservation with 30 by 30 and the openness to other tools for 50 by 50. It seems even more critical that we are laser focused on biodiversity in these first 30% in particular. So I'd like to hear you talk a little more about your choice there.
Maybe if I start, or do you? Okay. Well, there are a couple of different things. One, I do not want to, or I guess I need to start by saying that this was the thing that we wrestled with the most as we went through. And we heard from numerous stakeholders who did this work on kind of on all sides. There's not two sides of this question. This is not a binary question. This is a really complicated and nuanced question of how you would do this. What we ended up doing is represents a initial inventory recommendation. So I want to stress that off the bat, that this was the way that we provided this data back to you today without recommending wholesale changes to the categories to include new or different categories. We also believe and stand behind the notion that conserved lands support and restore biodiversity. They are the types of agricultural lands that support and restore biodiversity. And that's for a few reasons. One, that more than, roughly 50% of conserved agricultural lands are forests or wetlands. Another 44% are meadows that are either hayed or are grazed by livestock, and only about 14% are in annual crop production. So one, we think that the conserved landscape is a landscape that on a parcel by parcel basis is largely supporting biodiversity. It is also largely restoring biodiversity, which is what Gus alluded to earlier, and I think Abby will speak to from the perspective of the land trust, is that we've done hundreds of either retro OPAVs, which is that's a conservation tool we use on farms, where we've gone back and contributed to the restoration of that ecological resource through some kind of a new designation of protection for a stream or for a wetland. The land trust has also done hundreds of projects where they've gone back and just provided a retroactive easement overlay on top of one of those early farms that we've done. So because once a land comes into conservation, many more of those tools and programs and funding sources are available to support those, new buffers or expanded buffers or areas that are being protected. We feel like once it's conserved, it is supporting and contributing to the restoration of biodiversity. Lastly, when we looked at this and we were trying to find in the statutory language a way to understand within those first three categories how to address this to you in this first inventory, we looked at the definition of sustainable land management, which has some really, sorry, I'm gonna make it up. All right, my breakfast. There's a really some language in there that describes how agricultural lands fit under the definition of sustainable land management that speaks to the whole suite of values around agriculture, from economic and cultural to food production to natural resource protection. And so from our perspective, again, at least for this initial inventory, and the initial data crunch that we did, which didn't allow us to go down onto every parcel and say, there's 14 acres here that have annual crop production and 29 acres over here and 400 acres over there. That's a much longer process of analysis. This is the best recommendation that we can make, and one that we think is consistent with our values, consistent with the need to continue to protect land for food production, and to continue to work with private landowners, because a lot of the private landowners we're going to be working with going forward will be people who engage on some part of their parcel in the act of farming or food production. I don't know if either of you want to add anything to that.
I think, as Trey said, this was the most controversial subject that came up. Not everybody agreed upon it. We were trying to be completely transparent, presenting it to you. If you've asked us for a recommendation, and this is what it is. If you want to discount 14% of ag lands that are in crop production, let's just raise our goal. I think, as several people said to me, the state of Vermont should have a goal also to conserve farmland. That's certainly something we've all reckoned with. I think when we are working with landowners, we're dealing with integrated landscapes that include both farmland and forest land. We've also gotten the federal government to agree to allow us, when there's maple production, to use federal NRCS funds that are dedicated for farms just to those parcels as a local agricultural activity. So we think, and within the data, as Trey was saying, a parcel like the Huntington Town Forest, which has maybe a 30-acre, 20 or 30-acre meadow, and it shows up as an ag parcel when it is primarily a forested parcel. So based upon what was available to us, I guess the last thing I would say to you is, I think it's important as possible in asking your help for unity to build a big tent in which Vermonters come together. I think we saw through the pandemic, back in the days when many of us were afraid to go to the supermarket, the value of local food and being able to go to a local farm and get meat or eggs or whatever. And I think we want to continue to build upon that as part of our economy and our culture. So for all those reasons, we felt like this was not the point at which to drop it, trying to be transparent about it. We recognize that land that is in certain kinds of production is not going to contribute nearly as much, but sometimes when you stop development from happening, you've got from now until eternity to talk about what the best management practices ought to be. And that land may be, as with the Tangway farm, converted to some other use in 10 or 20 or 30 years. That may be more compatible with the vision in this bill. We don't know that, but we think that once conserved, there's reason to think that there will be other opportunities for conversation with landowners. And as somebody who helped us get the program going many years ago said to me, the best way to work with farm communities, education and compensation. See that in programs like the credit program. So we think there's lots of good reasons for our inclusion here, and we recognize that it doesn't meet everybody's needs and standards.
I just want to make sure that as we have this discussion, we don't set up a false dichotomy. Because I think everybody in the room is in favor of conserving agricultural land, which has nothing. But the question we're asking is, does that actually contribute to the goals of H 126 and biodiversity? So I just want to make sure we don't go down that path of somehow suggesting that if we're wondering about whether that actually fits the the law that it means somehow that we're not in favor of conservative development, because that's not what's going on. That, the question is, well, the question is the question of what the statute actually says. But what the question I was going to ask earlier was, when one of you talked about the fact that we're almost at 27% of conserved land, how much of that conserved land, that 27%, ended up in the inventory? And that goes to, I think, Chair's question about what were the criteria used to determine what was in, what was out.
All but the 48,000 acres or so of the uncategorized lands. So we included parcels with agriculture on them if they were conserved. We included conserved forest lands that were managed, under sustainable land management practices.
Okay, so
Yeah.
basically, just so I want to make sure I understood this. So basically, it was that you included the entirety of what is currently conserved, almost 27% of conserved land.
Yes.
Okay.
There's about, that's about 1%, that 45,000 is less than 1%.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. So we have 27% land conserved right now. How much of that 27% is in the Northeast Kingdom?
I don't know that we've broken it out by region. We can look at that and try to get that for you. Obviously, because of the Champion Lands, there's 133,000 acres
Yeah.
all at once. So
Would you dare to guess?
I'm not going to give you a guess today, but I will give you an answer when we've had some time to look at that.
My concern with that, and it's been addressed before, but we're looking at 30% by 30 and 50% by 50. I would like to see something fair throughout the state rather than all the land being bought in the Northeast Kingdom and removed from tax rolls. I know that we right now are about 43% conserved, above and beyond what the state has requested or what we would like to see. So I'd like to see other parts of the state kick in their fair share too. And I don't know if that can happen just because of the availability of what there is for properties now.
Well, I think not just where the lands that fit under the different conservation design categories or sort of the goal sets that we have, but also where are the landowners who wish to work towards conservation with a conserving organization.
Do you consider current use, people that put their land in current use as part of conservation of property?
We did not include that. Lands that are enrolled in the use value appraisal program but aren't otherwise conserved through an easement or state ownership were not included in this inventory.
Right.
As we talk about the 2050 goals and we talk about flexible and enduring tools, we should examine whether we think that current use counts. I think it raises an interesting question of how close we would be to the 50% goal if we did. And it raises another question: are there aspects of the current use program that should be changed or tweaked or enhanced to support that?
If I may just ask one more quick, thank you.
You're welcome.
I noticed in the start of your presentation, you showed a different number of different agencies that were involved in this. Were any sports groups like Trout Unlimited or Ducks Unlimited asked to participate?
They weren't asked directly, but the Traditions Coalition helped us with a focus group that brought a number of sportsmen and women to comment on this. There were comments from people at TU and DU as well, the backcountry hunters and anglers. So yes, we, as Gus said, we imagined our stakeholder group to be as broad as possible, and we'll continue to do so.
Great answer, thank you.
Let me just add that a couple of years ago, legislature enhanced or widened the current use program so that you could manage for, in a very narrow way, as I understand it, for a more wild setting rather than for timber harvest or something like that. So one of the things that I'm sure we will look at is, should we broaden that as an incentive to landowners to help them and help Vermont meet the goals that you've set forth?
Great. This reminds me of, as you're developing the final map, it would be somewhat to Representative Smith's point, but also to the underpinnings of Vermont conservation design that are called out in the statute. If the data could be compiled by biophysical region, and potentially even if it's available, natural community type. But I think conservation groups are excited to get going with this work. And to the extent that we can help them understand within their area of the state where there are gaps, that they could be really working on that proactive conservation work immediately, it would be really helpful.
We will do our best to provide that kind of data with the updated report, but it's also how we would go out to do work in the regions and local, communities in the next phase of this, is to bring that, your community is in this biophysical region. Here's what we see on conservation design. Here's what we see on the inventory map. Here's what we see on the kind of flood shed mapping that we're starting to do. And these are the, critical water resources that we should protect above and beyond regulation. So I think that's what we're hoping to be able to do when we go out and talk to communities in the next phase, is to help us see what the opportunities, priorities, and needs are in those local communities. Going back to what I said to Representative Smith, that we have to be able to pull people towards this if it's a voluntary action, right? This needs to be the choice of landowners. And so understanding at the local level how conservation design works, how conservation itself works, is going to be a critical part of our, roadshow as we go out and do this. But then we want people to feel like that they are in the driver's seat, that we're not telling them, you have to conserve your land, you have to conserve your land. It's those local organizations and municipalities, regional planners, conservation districts, conservation commissions. They're the ones with those relationships. So we really want to empower them with that kind of data and mapping and what have you.
Yep, which I'm hopeful the inventory will include. Thank you. It's 11 o'clock. You had 2 other witnesses listed, but we need to move on. We're going to take a 5-minute break and shift gears a little bit. Thank you again.